introduce you to the London Policy and Strategy Network. I know you've been a participant in our network and at previous sessions, so I'm really grateful for you to come and present the work that you're doing around the future of London. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Noel, and thanks everyone for carving out some time in your, I'm sure, busy days for this. I'm going to try and make it hopefully as worthwhile as possible. My name, as Noel said, I'm Rob Whitehead. I'm Director of Strategic Projects at Centre for London. We're London's think tank, so we try and identify London's biggest challenges and come up with novel ideas, solutions. We convene sort of debates, discussions, events, but importantly do new research as well to try and come up with new ideas for making our city better. I'm going to talk you through our biggest project at the moment called London Futures. Before I do that, though, can you please try and get your phones handy? You'll need a smartphone to be able to participate in this. There's going to be some interactivity quite quickly. So please have your phones ready and have it able to scan a QR code on the screen. I think it's a QR code. It might actually just be, I'm trying to think how it was going to come your way. Yeah, it will be a QR code. Hopefully that'll work. And if not, there'll be an alternative route. So just be ready for that. I'm going to try and share my screen now. There's going to be opportunities to input all the way through. If you've got a really pressing question, just let me or Noel know somehow, or just come in, and we can. I'm happy to take questions as we go, but I'm conscious there's quite a lot to get through as well to be able to get to the interesting sort of what next as well. So let's just try and bear that in mind. Right, here we go. Here's the sharing slides mode. Hopefully you can now see my slides. I can more or less see. London Futures. So this is a multi-year ambitious project to sort of take a look at where London is, and where London should go. We've been backed along the way by organisations reflecting the level of interest in this kind of work at the moment. You can see some of our big sponsors there across the private sector, the public sector, and the not-for-profit sector. We're delighted to have them on as part of the journey. The kind of why we're doing this question. So it feels like it's the moment to revisit the sort of dominant narrative that London has been settled with in a way for the last few decades. Around 1990, a kind of new story emerged around London, somewhat triggered by a report called London World City, which sort of established a new story around London being a key node of an increasingly globalizing economy, increasingly open, and that London was one of the sort of super nodes within that. And that kind of really took purchase, partly because London's economy had transformed, or was transforming, into being a very high-value service-dominated place. Not just in finance and insurance, but in lots of other service type jobs, such as media, education, etc. Coupled with this was a embracing of openness, obviously linked to things like expansion of the European Union, an increasing internationalism, a very vibrant and growing cultural offer that just sort of created this upward spiral, seemingly upward spiral of growth and new jobs and even regeneration of particular areas. And this sort of, became symbolized by new institutions of governance across the city, and even winning the Olympics is sort of the high point almost of this period, which were delivered in 2012 with some aplomb. But this sort of success story that we lived with and were part of masked a number of things which weren't going so well, and things which were not being resolved, and major challenges coming up. amongst them housing, widespread poverty, gross inequalities in a number of dimensions, and then the increasingly sort of growing pressure to do something around climate change, and then post-crash, the rise of sort of protectionism in its UK manifestation, Brexit, and now obviously COVID-19. So it feels like a good time to take stock and try and frame a new story for the next few decades. We're doing this over 3 phases. I won't bore you too much with this, but basically, first phase is let's work out where London is at, what's happened in recent years, and frame some of the ways we want to talk about the future. That's phase 1. That culminated with a report called London at a Crossroads in September. We're now in phase 2, which is about to sort of really take fire next week. And this is really where we try and talk to as many people, that's what I'm doing with you guys today, talk to as many people across London, both at the sort of in the sort of policy sphere, but also much wider too, activating as many, you know, opportunities to talk to Londoners, get their input about where London is and where London should go. That then all then sort of gets thrown into our what I call big bucket that we have to think through and synthesize into the beginnings, at least, of a story that London should adopt, could get behind to help direct and shape its future. And then, importantly, oh, and I've got the numbers wrong here. There's a phase 3 where we don't just leave this thing on the shelf and hope that people pay attention, but we actively go out and push it into conversations about London's future, both in London, these kind of conversations, but importantly into the national and maybe even international discourse about London and regions and places and constitutions even, so that London's voice gets heard and London gets to prosper in the ways that we want it to. That's the ambition, quite a big one. Before we do that, or as part of doing this, what we've tried to do is zoom out and kind of get abstract. Oh, hang on a minute. You can need your smartphones in a second. So we've just tried to sort of look at the ways that people think about cities and city life, and we've distilled this into a, like, if you like, a sort of framework. It's not a perfect one for the things that we might care about, the things that people care about in different ways to different extents about city life. This is our set of 10. We'll come back to this later as we talk about scenarios. But I'd just like to ask you now, first question, of these 10, democracy and governance and public services, there's a lot in there, liberty, health, sustainability, quality of place, prosperity, and a few others. Of these 10, which ones would you say, just in the abstract, you think is most important for making a good city? So you can choose, I think it allows you to choose 3. If you scan that code, you should be able to get straight onto this and make your choices. If you can't do it via the code, you can go to slido.com and put that 6-digit number in. With luck, this should be active and you should get people signing up. Let me know if there's any problem. By now, usually someone's in. Oh, here we go. We're in. Someone's in. It's working. So this is dynamic. Try not to be influenced too much by what other people are saying. Make your own choices. You can choose 3, like I said. We've definitely got a front runner there. Ah, interesting. Very good. So I think we've got about, Noel, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got about 25 people in the call.
Good, just over 30. So
okay.
few more people to contribute, but some emerging trends it looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but it's just a sort of gets us thinking, really, hopefully, about our values, what we care about, because these are the things which should drive setting the vision for the city in the long run. It looks like for us, and it's interesting given who you are, and maybe this is something we can come back to later. Quality of place and amenities has come top, followed by governance and public services. I wouldn't necessarily have predicted that. Oh, we've got fairness up there as well. Joint second. Very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave these polls open. So if you haven't had a chance or for some reason it hasn't worked, you can still go back in and vote for at least the next, let's say, day. Now, let me see. Hopefully, this will just move smoothly on. So our Crossroads report, I'm just going to give you some quick highlights. Many of you will be experts in these areas, so I'm not trying to take away from that. Just going to give you a sort of sense of what we've said in our first assessment of where London is at. We broke it into two parts, the Crossroads report. We have London today, and then there's a part about thinking about the future. In our London today section, we broke it into 6 areas. So we looked at people, economy, places and environment, institutions, importantly, London's place in the UK and where it is in the world. I'm just going to give you a sort of sense of what we said about each of these. There's more, obviously, in the report. Please do take a look, download it from our website. So on people, the general story we find is that London has, after many decades of decline, actually grown quite sharply in population terms since well, I think it actually inflected in the late 80s. And pre-COVID was projected to grow by another 2 million. And by and large, London's absorbed that growth pretty successfully. We have managed to revitalise areas, build new houses, and still stay pretty cohesive despite the growing diversity and the increased pressure on public services and transport. What went less well over that period, if you like, is that we've seen inequalities either stay the same or get worse by and large, not just in wealth and income, but also in other areas like education, in some regards, employment, safety, health, sometimes fueled by racism. You know, London is not the sort of non-racist city that some people conceive it to be when you look at the evidence. There's more people living in London than any other part of the UK, often missed out in the kind of national discussion. Just a list of some of the inequalities that we see in London. Lots of areas where London does do well comparatively, but many where it is not doing well. I mentioned some of them already, but includes other things like pension and poverty, maternal employment, which have ramifications, clearly. On economy and business, it's pretty clear that on many kind of headline terms, London has boomed in the last few decades. London's now almost a quarter of the UK economy, despite having only 14% of the population. London has transformed into this global hub for high value professional services across a really quite wide range of industries. So like I said before, not just in banking and insurance, but also in law, in education, often in medicine, certainly in creative industries, cultural industries. London is an absolute mecca. Sometimes it's kind of hard when you live in London to sort of see the truth of that. I lived in Geneva for 3 years, having worked in the London Development Agency for 8, and I really, that's when it landed. Like, it wasn't just the hype, it was the truth of how people outside saw London. We'll come on to more of that. But what's gone less well in economic terms is that the thing which has driven the London success, which was outstripping the rest of the UK in bold terms on productivity growth, which was pretty clear up to the financial crash, that has stalled. There is no longer a gap in productivity growth with the rest of the UK. In other words, the thing which really drives prosperity or differences in prosperity isn't really there in London at the moment. And in outcome terms, we know that way too many people are still on low wages, despite this prosperity and wealth. Low wages are very low for lots of people in London. On institutions, there's lots of easy success stories to tell here. London London's governance from the London I remember back in the 80s and 90s has transformed. We've got a mayoralty, an assembly, much better organised and governed transport system, and as a result of that, it's kind of, certainly until the last few years, it was kind of acquiring new powers and authority over time, including on the Olympics. That, though, has dwindled in recent years, and not only does it feel like it's stalling that process, but it does feel like there is actually a genuine risk, and it's incredible to even be saying it, that some of those devolution gains might be rolled back relatively soon. This links very much to London's position in the UK. For quite some time, certainly in this period that we've been reflecting on, London was seen as sort of the golden, the sort of poster child for the UK, the kind of necessary breadwinner, if you like, drawing in investment, tourism, and the like. What that's transformed, certainly given political changes of the last few years, into being seen as a sort of millstone almost, that London's differences with the rest of the UK is now something that needs tackling very deliberately. Some people have even suggested that the levelling up agenda, as it's called, could turn into a kind of levelling down. In fact, some commentators are saying COVID is sort of bringing that to bear. On London and the world, the story is rosier. Although it might feel like London's been knocked off its perch in recent years, the general evidence shows that London's still regarded incredibly favourably internationally. You could argue, based on some measures, that London's the #1 city in the world. It's certainly in the top, tier, driven by these sort of fundamentals of openness and talent and investment and good institutional frameworks, sound infrastructure, good management. But we do know, and we can see in the evidence, that competition's growing. There are lots of other cities that are booming and thriving and offering different things, better things to people and firms. London doesn't score so well on things like affordability and safety. When you look at when you crunch through all the numbers, and there are a number of city benchmarks, some of you may have seen, if you take a kind of composite of all of them, you can see that actually objectively London's position has dropped from top 5 to top 15 in the last 5 years. That's a pretty big jump when you think this composite is based on a whole bunch of different ways of judging and scoring people's perceptions of cities. So there's something kind of worrying going on there. We tried to distill our take on where London's at into what we see as being the major challenges. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. We can come back to it. There's loads more in the report. There are certainly things which are, could be added, could be taken away, but there's a number of them. You can see I used the sort of values framework here to lay them out. So turning a bit now to how we sort of set up our thinking about the future. Really, we took sort of 3 angles, as well as, well, our sort of starting point was the challenges. We tried to sort of zoom out and think about what are the things that London has no control over, really, but we'll have to respond to, and in a way everywhere is going to have to respond to these in some form. What are the big challenges? First one for us is obvious. Well, the first 2 really are quite obvious. Recovery from coronavirus is going to dominate our public life for quite a long time. I think it's fair to say. I won't dwell on that too much. We might come back to that. Climate change goals is now firmly set, has been somewhat pushed off course by COVID. but it's not going to go away, and COP26 is only going to cement that in the UK. Our third one is disruptive technologies and services. And really this is trying to look at what's going on in terms of innovations that have the power to change how we live. Massively improve it in many senses, but also potentially have downsides. Certainly has the potential and is already doing to change power relationships, not always for the better. What does that mean for how we operate as a city? Fourth one I've touched on already, rise of nationalism and populism, really a post-crash phenomenon, certainly still playing out, hopefully not too long run a phenomenon. Something London has to think about its response to, though. Fifth one is the rise of Asian economies. This is a really deep-seated trend dating back to probably the 80s, and looks like sticking to the trajectory more or less that we've been seeing over the last decades. In other words, Asia keeps on rising and will be, I think China's going to be a fifth of the global economy by 2050. India about 15% of the global economy. These are, you know, incredibly significant and weighty facts. And the last one, different to the rest, is that everywhere's getting older. Everyone's getting older. And this is true not just in the developing world, but also across pretty much everywhere, including in London. And this can have ramifications for, well, many, many dimensions of how we live and how we might want our city to be. So those are our 6, just remind you. Are there any really significant things there, or sort of outside of those 6, that you think merit being, if you like, at that sort of top table of mega forces, mega trends that we should be thinking about that will shape our future? This is your chance to submit your ideas. Now, by the powers of Slido, you're going to get an opportunity. Hang on a sec. Let's see what happens next. Here we go. If you go here, I think you get to just write in other things that you think will shape the future everywhere. Remember, this isn't just trends in London. This is global mega trends. What else is going on that's going to influence everywhere? Migration. Thank you very much, whoever put that in. I think you can just type in anything. You can probably put multiple entries in if you've got any other thoughts. Urbanisation, very good. There's definitely discussion at the moment about whether COVID will have arrested the trend towards urbanisation. AI, robotics, definitely part of the mix. Access to internet, excellent. I had a thought just the other day that maybe schools won't be 5 days a week. Maybe they'll have Mondays and Fridays working from home days, like lots of offices will be going to. Attractivity of cities, very good. If you've got any more thoughts, throw those in. That's very helpful. Right, I'm going to move on. We looked at some other places for inspiration about how they deal with some of the big issues facing cities. We looked at Tokyo and how they use the private sector to deliver affordable housing in a very different way to our approach in the UK. We looked at Medellin, how they've managed public utilities to public good using sort of novel public-private partnerships. We looked at Barcelona and Paris, how they're managing public space and roads, street space. And we also looked at Wales, where they've got an interesting law that sort of forces the consideration of impact on future generations, which some of you may be familiar with. So just some inspiring, interesting case studies to help us think through what might be the right approach for London. And then getting to the end point. This is where we, you know, thinking about the future is hard. And I'd say it's even harder at the moment where there's so many uncertainties. You know, COVID has thrown so much up in the air. It's making us question even really key tenets of London's development, paradigm, if you like. Like, is the population even going to grow? We've been, certainly in planning circles in London, we've been assuming growth of population. There's not much reason at the moment, I see, to assume that, or to be certain that that's the case for now. So one of the ways you get through, and many of you will know this and do this and be good practitioners in it, one of the ways that you can think about uncertainty for the future is to posit some scenarios. So we've crafted 5 scenarios which we think are plausible or on the edge of plausibility, possible, certainly, not necessarily desirable. We have not we've deliberately avoided saying this is our preference. Instead, what we did, I'm getting a strange echo now. I don't know if anyone's changed an audio setting. Oh no, it seems to be better. What we've done is we took those 10 values that we laid out at the beginning, so health, security and resilience, and we paired them up. And we built a scenario based on going hard, if you like, in that direction over the next few decades. So this is where, take the example of Safety First London. Imagine, and I think this is pretty plausible at the moment, imagine that the absolute #1 public priority becomes health, security and resilience. That we throw caution to the wind around, say, surveillance or privacy of data, and we make everyone have trackers. We track their vaccination status, but also lots of other things to make sure that we absolutely optimize to public health and safety. What would that look like? So these are thought experiments designed to provoke a debate. And I'll just kind of sketch through with you what each one looks like. I can share more of this, by the way, afterwards. It's also all in the report that's available online. So our first scenario is 15-minute London. This is a rubric that's bandied about a lot at the moment. For us, this was a bringing together of environmental concerns with improving the quality of place, something you guys voted for quite highly at the beginning. So really, this is about reducing our impact in terms of externalities, pollution, emissions, investing in the local, at the cost of perhaps some growth, perhaps some air travel opportunities. You'll see here our totemic project is we convert some of our airport capacity into a solar energy farm. That's a little provocative. We ban using fossil fuels by 2030, but we get to net zero by 2030. And we might do that through expanding road user charging. London becomes a leading green place fast and a pleasant place to live in the sense of local amenity. So that's the first scenario. Our second scenario is where you go hard. I have to say this is looking least plausible at the moment, potentially. Where you go hard on pushing power for London and Londoners. So this would be ramping up like a sort of Devo Max option, if you like. And London, the advantage of this, the argument is that London gets to tailor policy and management to its own needs much more swiftly, much more effectively than it's able to do at the moment. There are tons of ways. London has very little control over itself compared to other major cities. So this is really trying to address that deficit. It might result in us having more control about migration. It might result in us getting to net zero faster than at least government targets. It might mean we grow faster. It would certainly mean London-wide government has more power, almost certainly the lower tiers too, and potentially is a route to getting more power into the hands of everyday citizens. Our third one is a bit the sort of continuation of the last few decades. We call it London mega capital, and this is one where you go hard on growth and jobs and power for London, but not London institutions. So this might result in more prosperity, more jobs, more infrastructure investment, perhaps an expanding of the boundary of London to bring in those other, what are effectively London suburbs that currently aren't inside the administrative area. It might mean we go slower, it probably would mean we go slower to get to net zero because we're not prioritising decarbonisation, but the population will grow. Leveled up London is a very different scenario. This is where a consensus emerges that fairness kind of trumps everything else as a priority, driven by what's been revealed by COVID in health inequalities and impacts. Lots of ways, and by the way, some of these infer new powers for London. Like, this is hard to do without new powers and a new devolution settlement. So that's a sort of necessary quirk of this process. So a totemic project here is public transport's free. We might requisition empty homes and redistribute them. In other words, it's a sort of equality first approach to all policy areas. The results being inequalities between groups are reduced, poverty is definitely tackled in many respects. We might see the end of street homelessness, etc. Our last one, I've already mentioned this a few times, but in a way this is sort of the easier one to imagine at the moment, but it's not necessarily the one that people instinctively move towards. Safety First London is where the sort of just-in-time world becomes the just-in-case world. I wasn't the first to use that, but I'm stealing it. And we think about the kind of risks, and we mitigate those risks as the sort of top priority. So this is the one that avoids the next pandemic. This is the one where we deal with global warming and adapt to it as best we can. It might mean we start work on a new Thames barrier because the risk of flooding through catastrophic climate change is not really a risk, it's sort of a reality. Lots of other things will go slower as a result. Aviation might not recover. It will have it will reach into the private space, probably more than any of the other ones, in terms of primary healthcare, data sharing, etc., etc. So big ramifications for citizens, as they all have, really. Having heard all that, and I appreciate this is quick, I would like you to vote for one. Which of these is your preferred future scenario for London? Where would you like to live? I'm genuinely very interested in what you say, because this gets quite different reactions depending on who you talk to. I've taken it to London First, I've taken it to London funders, I've taken it to students, and I hope to be able to get more and more feedback from lots of others. I think it only allows you to vote for one. Correct me if I'm wrong. Interesting so far. Leveled up London is looking like the front runner. 15-minute London not far behind. The kind of jobs over everything, London mega capital is a third. The other two haven't got a vote yet. It's very interesting. Okay, Well, I'll leave that poll open because some of you undoubtedly will want to ponder that one a bit more. There's more material out there, like I said. Now then, just as a sort of, and I'm winding up here, I'm just thinking about time. How are we doing? Yeah, not too bad. One of the things that we're challenged with is trying to come up with what should be the new vision for London. I just want you to use a moment to think about what you would want to see if you were setting out a new vision for the city to take us to 2050. What words would you want to be in there? What phrase, what thing would feel like, yeah, that's the city I want to be in. That's the city I want to bequeath to my children or my friends' children. That's the one that's going to make London really fly. Any words? Have a go. Very good. Thank you for those that have submitted so far. Nice. I'm going to leave that open. Keep putting your thoughts in. We might come back to this. But with a view to getting towards the end and just telling you about what happens next. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're in the middle of a big engagement phase. We're about to launch a new website next week called Your Future London, which is a tool which we hope people will share widely to put some of this research in front of people, but also importantly, get a sense from people about what they value. So what would you rather have in your future? A fairer city or a safer city, for example? I mean, done slightly better than that, but hope you get the idea. We're really interested. We really would like to get links to others that would like to be part of the conversation, that have got channels that could share the website or some of the other content we're producing, to get the debate going and get Londoners' input into these things. That might be through community groups, through councils, through staff, through members, or directly out to Londoners through Facebook groups or Twitter or wherever. If you've got any roots to that and you're interested in being part of this and can help, then I'd really like to hear from you either now or offline. That would be great. This is a way you can contact me. That's the website that we'll be launching next week. I hope you found that interesting. Hopefully there's a bit of time for a bit of debate and discussion. Maybe I'll just go back to the words that you have been submitting, because that might help us with our discussion. Here we go. Noel.
Cool. Thanks a lot. And I can hear my own feedback. That was so rich in insight and so comprehensive. And I guess the question I've got, is that the kind of different sectors will be looking at kind of the future of London and like what decisions they need to make in response to that. But then at the same time, the major players in London, be they investors, developers, employers, councils, other institutions, the first major steps that they take actually also have an influence on the future of London. So, for example, if a major employer decides to stop using its HQ in a particular borough, that can create a spillover effect for other companies, and then for the council to be like, what are we going to do with the city centre? They're all leaving. Likewise, if the council or if the GLA decide to do something radically different in a borough or in the centre of London, then companies react to that. And for example, the 15-minute neighbourhoods or 15-minute city is very effective as a concept, because it kind of brings together a variety of different trends in quite an accessible brand, rather than something which can be like a variety of things, talking about like zero carbon and like inclusive economy, which can be quite inaccessible words. Whereas like quite a few people are diving into that 15-minute neighborhood. concept. So I guess what do you think is the role for councils in this space? Is it to convene those major players in their borough to be like, so what you're thinking, and let's do that thinking together? Or is it to try and use kind of like brands, let's say like 15-minute neighborhood or whatever they want to use to try and kind of get a bit of momentum around something? Yeah, just wondering what you were thinking about that. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I think it's a good question, Noel, and one of the big challenges ahead, and certainly one for local authorities. My sort of slightly trite answer, so apologies in advance, is I think local authorities and other people with roles in this space are going to need to become better placemakers. So being much more active about the mix of things over time and in different time periods that happen in their areas. I think Camden's probably, not too bad at this already, just thinking about the bits of Camden I know, but it probably needs to, get twice as good at it over this quite fragile time. Certainly that was the view talking to the Corporation of London recently. Their view was in the past, look, places sort of made themselves because there was so much demand for space that kind of the dynamism took care of it to a degree, obviously. You've got to kind of manage the barriers and boundaries. But now it's going to be much more, you've got to be in the kernel of making a place than maybe we've been in the past. And that's difficult in a world where you're overstretched and you maybe don't have the skills. So how do you get into that virtuous circle of having those capabilities and powers to actually craft good places? And that's true of on a bigger scale of, say, Westminster, and the centre of London as it is of, say, Crouch End or Bow Road. It's each place needs its own orchestration in a way, and I fear that we're not very good at that generally because we've sort of been denuded over time, and we need to build that back up, I think.
Cool. So people do put your questions in the chat or put your hands up. I can see there's a question that was earlier on in the chat about, do you get very different responses for different audiences that you've been speaking to, whether it's about the scenarios or what makes a good city?
Well, kind of yes, and that shows that we've tried. I mean, what we've tried to do, hopefully, as it shows, is we've tried to balance up different things that matter, and give each a chance for expression. So yeah, so London First had a different reaction to where you guys ended up. However, there are some real deep-seated changes afoot, I think, and I think equality, and maybe I'm just predisposed to saying this, but I think equality is one of the areas which has risen substantially over the last 12 months and seems to be permeating even, the kind of red-blooded, business, hard-nosed business heads in a way that it wasn't before. In a way that maybe climate change has done for the last few years, and is now part of the consensus. Feels like there's something of an emerging consensus about addressing inequalities. I might be wrong.
No, I think the work you're doing is provides a really good way to kind of to play back those insights you're getting from different stakeholders and to bring those different stakeholders together to debate that when it comes to specific issues, and then what we do about it. There's a question about how involving kind of young people in shaping the vision of London going forward, and how we might do that, but also how hard it is to engage young people, particularly particularly during the pandemic. You mentioned you kind of been speaking to students. What reactions are you getting from young people, and how you doing that?
Well, 2 points. One is young people are worried about jobs, definitely, and that came through much stronger from students than say from this audience. That there is a clear and pressing, almost emergency around job opportunities for young people. I think that's just sort of, when you think about it, it's kind of obvious, but certainly comes through. One of the ways that we're really trying to, I'm just going to share my screen again, this Your Future London website. I'm going to give you a sneak preview, first time ever. Hopefully you'll see that here we've got some animation. We try to build something that's a bit different to the standard think tank routes. So rather than saying this is how you should think about the world and here's our recommendations, we're actually just trying to use tools like this to get in front of people, to get them thinking about it in a digestible way that works in the way that people now consume media and consume ideas and thoughts. It's the TikTok generation. We've got to adapt to that way of processing input and getting feedback. So there's lots of animation and there's a quiz. It's hopefully much more accessible than in previous ways we might have done things. Now I know others have done things like this much better than we have, but we're trying to move in that direction too.
I've got a question here in terms of about how much the research and the scenarios could be applied to other UK cities. Obviously, you focus the research on London, given who you are. But yeah, kind of, do you think some of this could apply to other cities like Leeds or Bristol or other big cities in UK, or do they need to do their own research and scenarios to work it out?
I mean, I think the process we've used, it's not perfect at all, and everyone will be able to find a way of improving on it. But the process we've used or are in the middle of using, you could certainly apply to other places. And some of the insights about what other cities are doing, case studies, mega trends, all of that's, translatable very quickly. As is some of the approaches we've taken for researching London. Much of it's done on national data sets and the like. So it's pretty translatable. Whether other cities, certainly smaller cities, are going to be facing the same challenges as London, I think is quite debatable. I think London's in a particular moment, especially central London, but in a way that begs challenges of the whole governance of London as well. That's feels quite unique, but we'll see. We'll see what happens in Paris and New York and other places.
And I think there's something interesting with what you were saying before about some of London, the devolution to London has kind of stagnated, or in some cases fallen back. Mm-hmm. And when you look at Greater Manchester, as a sneak preview, Greater Manchester are going to share what they're doing to tackle the pandemic. I think, to be honest, I think Greater Manchester has been much better than London as a collective of public institutions at kind of taking the reform, and it's still a massive challenge. I think that London collectively, I don't mean the GLA per se. I think we can all include responsibility in that as boroughs. We've been way too complacent just because we're the capital and we've got big natural advantage. So I think there's definitely lessons that we can learn, and I guess that there could be spillover effects of what happens in London. I'm thinking about people moving out of London, or where the city no longer becomes such an attraction for places to live, but the headquarters are still there. You have much more home working. That actually there could be a greater connection between London and beyond Greater London as a set of cities. And then without wanting to mention HS2, there are, in terms of travel connection, there's got to be much better collaboration between London and connected cities through transport in terms of like in terms of trade and like workers and other things like that, which will be interesting to what extent that actually plays out through the scenarios.
Yeah, and I think zooming out a bit more, I talked about London being built on high value service economy. So that's one truth. Second truth, basically services are moving online. So what does that mean for how we think about places that have previously prospered on being service kind of entrepôts? What is it? It is really challenging for our paradigms of city economies, especially in high service economy geographies. So, quite what we mean by economic success of London is up for debate in and of itself. If all the people who work at, I don't know, Pfizer live in Berkshire and never come to London except to go to the theatre or to go shopping or to, is that bad for London or good for London? This is not clear where all this goes. We're really just living a big part of the transformation, the digital transformation. This is but an early chapter in the process of digitizing the service economy. What does that mean for places? 15-minute city might be part of the answer there. What does it mean for big cities, mega cities, where previously they've had this moment of flourishing on concentration of services? Don't know. No, there's a lot up for grabs.
Cool. I'm conscious we got 3 minutes left, so I think really great presentation, Rob, and I'd definitely encourage people to check out the website. There's so much in there, and more than was available to share in the hour that we had today. And I think some great audience interaction as well, because that really puts the focus on like where do we go from here, just thinking about our own reactions to the future. Next week we've got the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts, who are going to take us through their future change framework, which is kind of looking at more of a kind of like mid-term perspective, like what are the things that like we stop, we continue, or like we do differently. And if your organization, be that a council or other organization like Rob's, want to share your work in progress, whether you're looking at the future or how you're tackling the pandemic or deep diving on a particular issue, do get in touch. We really like to hear. I think I think during the pandemic, I think kind of like work in progress is the way forward. There's no like fixed solution, and never a point at which we're complete as we're adapting to this really strange situation. And that's why I kind of really welcome Rob's presentation in helping us think about the different like factors and different scenarios that might shape our future, and up to us as organizations to take that, to have conversations with people, to engage with the wider London community through the Centre of London's work, and to start sharing what we're doing, because that also creates a conversation with other businesses in our local areas, other communities, as a way of sharing their thinking as well. So thanks everyone for participating. I think we'll share your slides. Rob, did you want to share?
Yeah, sorry, just to wrap up. Sorry, thanks, Noel. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all for your inputs. I'm sorry I'm not very good at tracking the chat questions as I speak. I'm too old for that kind of multitasking. I just want to say I'm really in the business of getting out and talking to other organisations, groups, strategy meetings, away days, anyone that might feel appropriate for this kind of conversation. We're also going to be producing materials that might enable you to have those conversations or workshops or seed them with others around these big questions. There's also going to be part live, I think from next week, a consultation response, like a more standard way of feeding in more detailed answers than this kind of slightly more young oriented your future London angle. So there's lots of ways into this debate. We're trying to foster and enable as many of them as we can. Please do get in touch with me directly if you want to hear more, if you want to take advantage of that in some way.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Rob.
Thanks.